Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience and welcome to the Newman Center. My name's Peter. I'm an animator with Catholic Conscience and the St. Monica's Institute, and I am moderating these Faith and Reason lectures on behalf of the Newman Center. And it's my great pleasure to have here with us tonight Professor Randy Boyagoda, who is with the English Department at the University of Toronto at St. Mike's College, where he also serves as an academic administrator and teaches the infamous Gilson Seminar in Faith and Ideas. And he's the author of 6 books, including the novels Original Prin and Dante's Indiana, which I gather are parts 1 and 2 of the Prinity. So maybe he'll give us a sneak peek at what's coming next in that regard. And he's a regular contributor at publications in Canada, in the US, like the CBC, Globe and Mail, Wall Street Journal. So it's really a great privilege to have him here tonight. He's going to talk about beauty and the arts through the lens of horror movies. So without further ado, welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much, Peter, and good evening, everyone. It's very good to see all of you here. I want to begin just by acknowledging a couple of people who are here. One would be my beloved wife, Anna, who's always so supportive and is always on time for events. Anna? Oh. Okay. I'm going to go sit back down now. It's great to see members of the various Gilson Seminars here and your friends. Great to see the larger members of the Catholic community, members of the Newman Center here and of the Archdiocese more broadly. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge being with us today, my good friend David Mulrooney, the longtime major figure in the public life of Canada and former president of the University of St. Michael's College. And the reason I acknowledge David in particular is because he gave me $20 in Bitcoin to do so. And I wanted to use it before it went to zero. And also because the last time I was here for a Newman lecture, it was David's. Actually, this was pre-pandemic, and it was on faith and reason and public life, and the call to public life in the context of Catholic life. And so it's very good to be here in this same context. The title of my talk tonight is The False, the Bad, and the Ugly. Looking for faith and beauty in movies and other dark mirrors. In my remarks this evening, I will be bringing together a series of classic and abiding sources for thinking about the false, the bad, and the ugly, including Augustine, Dante, and I think particularly fitting for this location and a related feast day, St. Thomas Aquinas. That said, I would like to begin by drawing on 2 classic sources for thinking about the relationship between faith and beauty, Joseph Ratzinger and Stephen King. Thank you, David. Let me start by reading a selection from the opening to the late Ratzinger's Introduction to Christianity, which should be familiar, I hope, to many people in this crowd. For reasons that should become clearer as my remarks develop, I encourage you to pay a special mind to the figure of the clown in Ratzinger's opening articulation of the problem of religious belief, specifically belief in the propositions of Christianity in the modern age. This is from Ratzinger. Anyone who tries today to talk about the question of Christian faith in the presence of people who are not thoroughly at home with ecclesiastical language and thought soon comes to sense the alien and alienating nature of such an enterprise. He will probably soon have the feeling that his position is only too well summed up in Kierkegaard's famous story of the clown and the burning village. According to this story, a traveling circus in Denmark caught fire. The manager thereupon sent the clown, who was already dressed up and made for the performance, into the neighboring village to fetch help, especially as there was danger that the fire would spread across the fields of dry stubble and engulf the village itself. The clown hurried into the village and requested the inhabitants to come as quickly as possible to the blazing circus and to help put the fire out. But the villagers took the clown's shout simply for an excellent piece of advertising meant to attract as many people as possible to the performance. They applauded the clown, and they laughed till they cried. The clown felt more like weeping than laughing. He tried in vain to get the people to be serious, to make it clear to them that this was no stunt, that he was not pretending, but was in bitter earnest, that there was really a fire. His supplications only increased the laughter. People thought he was playing his part splendidly, until finally the fire did engulf the village. It was too late for help, and both circus and village were burned to the ground. Ratzinger cites this story as an analogy of the theologian's position today, and sees the theologian as the clown who cannot make people really listen to his message. In his medieval or at any old-fashioned clown's costume, he is simply not taken seriously. Whatever he says, he is ticketed and classified, so to speak, by his role, Ratzinger writes. Whatever he does in his attempts to demonstrate the seriousness of his position, people always know in advance that he is, in fact, just a clown. Now, as we would expect, having offered this analogy, Ratzinger proceeds to develop it in ways that make the dilemma of modern belief more complex and personally implicating than merely lamenting that theologians, perhaps religious believers, come across as clowns not to be taken seriously. Now, for my purposes this evening, the figure of a clown is someone not to be taken seriously when it comes to higher order questions of human life and value. A figure that has much to do with the most prominent clown to figure in American popular culture over the past few years. I refer to Pennywise, the malevolent antagonist of Stephen King's 1986 novel, It, which was adapted into a film by director Andy Muschietti that was released in September 2017. With figures adjusted for inflation, It remains the highest-grossing horror movie of the past 25 years, and one of the top 5 all-time for the domestic American box office. If we are called to read the signs of the times and find ways to make sense of these signs for ourselves and for others, ultimately, in support of Anna, you can come sit. It's okay. Everybody knows you're late. It's fine. Come, it's fine. Hi, that's Anna, everybody. Remember I mentioned earlier how she was here and she was there? Okay, good. I'm going to hear about that one on the way home, everybody. If we're called to read the signs of the times and find ways to make sense of how these signs for ourselves and others are ultimately in support of refining and advancing our understandings of faith, of beauty, of reason, the popularity of this movie, given its ideas, its themes, and its representations of human experience, merit attention, I propose to you this evening. Now, for those who do not know it, the story of It goes something like this. Set in the small town of Derry, Maine in the 1980s, a group of teenage misfits tries to make sense of why people, and children in particular, go missing at a rate that's much higher than anywhere else in America. These disappearances have a particular significance for one character, Bill, whose little brother, Georgie, is one of the latest to go missing. As the story develops, the characters have terrifying encounters, individually and together, with a malevolent clown named Pennywise, who, we learn, emerges from some netherworld every 27 years to feed on the children of the town. With adults either not taking note or purposely ignoring the situation, the kids themselves decide to fight the clown and attempt to banish it from their town and their lives. King's novel is about 1,000 pages, and the movie is 2 hours, and I have about 25 minutes. So it strikes me as efficient to show you the trailer now and to proceed from there into a discussion of what it means for our culture to regard evil and, as manifestations finally of evil, the false, bad, and ugly, to regard evil as a clown, and what this means in turn for our thinking about faith and beauty, goodness, and truth. And so I'm going to ask if it's possible now to play the trailer. My thumb isn't working, but okay. So just watch this. Let's watch it 5 more times. I want you to consider something, having just seen that trailer, perhaps for the first time or perhaps not. When that trailer was first released, it generated 197 million individual views in 24 hours. This was a record at the time. The movie had a budget of $35 million, and it grossed more than $500 million and broke various box office records, as I'd mentioned, while ranking highly, even with inflation adjusted, on various all-time lists. Now here's what's interesting to me. At the time of its release, reviews were generally positive, but no one has ever pointed to this movie as some kind of signal masterpiece of American cinema, right? We're exponentially far away even from something like The Exorcist, let's say. So why then did it prove so popular? And why does this popularity matter to us 6 years later, under the auspices of this, the Faith and Reason Lecture Series convened by Catholic Conscience, the St. Monica Institute, and our host, the Archdiocese Newman Center here at the University of Toronto? For 2 reasons, I propose. First, to cite a representative assessment of the film, New York Times film critic A.O. Scott observes that the clown in the movie is, quote, the literal, lethal manifestation of evil in the world. Scott further notes that the clown's success in pursuing his purposes is, quote, abetted and to some extent camouflaged by the ordinary human awfulness that also afflicts this town, an ugly assortment of bullies, gossips, and abusive parents. Unintentionally, perhaps, Scott here invokes 2 traditional and intersecting conceptions of evil. Evil as a phenomenon, and evil as the outcome of free will gone wrong. In so doing, he's drawing our attention to the film's investment in a continuum of ordinary human behavior and supernatural phenomena that affirms the evil and false and ugly instead of the true and good and beautiful. I will say more on these points in a moment, but for now, by way of the commentary I cited earlier from Ratzinger, the movie immediately suggests what? We needn't take the phenomenon of evil, of the false, the bad, the ugly. We don't need to take it seriously. It's just a clown. We can just be entertained by it. And indeed, we have been, as the box office receipts suggest, and with one particular demographic in mind, which brings me to the second reason why I think this movie merits some attention this evening. Almost 50% of the people who watched it in the theaters were in their late teens and early 20s. Now, by way of transition, let's shift from Ratzinger's introduction to Christianity to Notre Dame sociologist Christian Smith's cogent account of millennial religious belief, what he terms moralistic, therapeutic deism. I'm going to argue as this talk develops that the very same sensibility that's captured in the concept of moralistic, therapeutic deism finds an effective corollary in the false and bad and ugly, in evil itself, as it's represented in this movie, and likewise in how we are called to respond to its presence in our lives, according to the logics of the culture that sustains this movie. But if we step back for a moment, evil in the Catholic intellectual tradition has 2 major and long since synthesized source definitions. The first, from St. Augustine in his writings on Genesis and the fall, and in response to challenges from the Manichees, concerns the existence of evil as a lesser result of the greater good of God's creating man with a free will. This is the very line that cuts through every heart, by way of Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn's famous quotation. The second major account of evil comes from our feast day patron, St. Thomas Aquinas, who in consonance with and extending Augustine proposes in the Summa, quote, what evil is must be known from the nature of the good. This eventually leads to an understanding of evil as deprivation, as the absence of the good. That this absence is something made possible and enacted by our combined status as fallen persons endowed with free wills has long been written about by theologians and others, and likewise, the question of how we should understand the existence of evil beyond our individuated susceptibility to it. This latter matter interests me especially in the context of these remarks. How should we understand evil especially if, by way of Aquinas and those whose work he engaged and those who have since engaged with his work, how do we understand evil as a deprivation, an absence? And in turn, how can that kind of absence help us think about presence? Part of my reflection in this respect comes from sensing that our cultural moment is such that it's easier to represent and point to absence rather than represent and point to presence, for lots of reasons. But rather than only lament this, and I think every member of the Gilson Seminar in this room would know this, and this church would know this, we should accept the nature of the situation we are in and make use of it however we can for the greater good. Having said that, at the end of these remarks, and turning more to my work as a novelist and a professor, I'll offer a brief sense of how I have tried to find a little light in the dark mirrors of our cultural moment. But first, the great majority of us, I think, have long naturally turned to two sources in our attempts to make sense of evil: the visual arts and stories. From my vantage as a novelist and an English professor, it's to stories that we turn for understanding so much about human experience, including the problem of evil. As the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur argued in his magisterial 3-volume study, Time and Narrative, human beings are by nature storytelling creatures. We understand ourselves and our lives in narrative terms, and we seek the same understanding in engaging the people and phenomena around us. This is all straightforward enough when it comes to much of human experience, including evidence of evil that results from the disordered exercise of our free will. But if we accept Aquinas' definition of evil as privation, as the absence of the good, this poses a natural paradox for any artist. How do you create something, a presence, to represent an absence? Before returning to the representation of evil in the movie It, I think it best to make sense of this, as of so much in life, by way of Dante's Divine Comedy. In the 34th canto of Inferno, Dante and Virgil reach the icy depths of hell, the fourth ring of the ninth circle, where they encounter Lucifer, the massive emperor of this inverted kingdom, who, we are reminded, as Dante writes, was once a handsome presence. No longer, obviously, but in Dante's rendering, his present hideousness is a privation pointing to a presence, which for us is a preeminent demonstration of how literary artists give shape and logic to the representation of evil. Dante observes of Lucifer that, quote, if he was once as handsome as he now is ugly, and despite that raised his brows against his maker, one can understand how every sorrow has its source in him. Thereafter, he offers us a striking view of Lucifer's ugliness. He had 3 faces, Dante writes, one in front blood red, and then another 2 that just above the midpoint of each shoulder joined the first. Each of Satan's faces is winged. His 6 eyes weep tears and blood, and he is encased in ice and eternally eating and flaying and crushing 3 traitors, Judas, Brutus, and Cassius. Virgil informs Dante that as their last hike through hell, they must climb Satan's icy, shaggy flanks because, quote, it is by such stairs that we must take our leave of so much evil. Eventually, the poet and his guide emerge, quote, to see once more the stars, and from there make their way to purgatory and eventually paradise. I think we'd be hard-pressed to find a literary representation better than Dante's of evil as both acts of disordered free will resulting in eternal damnation and as an exterior phenomenon whose depravity affirms supreme goodness and presence, not least because this representation corresponds so fully to clarity, proportion, and integrity, the 3 defining features of a work of art that Etienne Gilson, Umberto Eco, and other modern scholars and thinkers have written about, also drawing on Aquinas in doing so. So when it comes to Inferno, the poem's clarity is evident in how it unfolds a story that radiates an intelligibility about the consequences of leading a life governed by a disordered free will. The poem's proportion is evident in its integration of metaphysical and physical logics, particularly with respect to the kinds of physical punishments sinners endure in proportion to their offenses against the will of God. Finally, The poem's integrity is evident in its wholeness of imagined world, inferno, purgatory, paradise, and the many syntheses, integrations, and harmonies that endow the poem with such force and meaning, beginning, famously, with its rendering and revelation of, quote, so much evil, as Virgil puts it, evident throughout the 9 circles of hell, and culminating in that encounter with Lucifer. So now, from Augustine, from Aquinas, and Dante, we're going to move to Stephen King and the movies. When it comes to the relationship between faith and art, whether seeking depictions and evocations of the good, true, and beautiful, or of the bad, the false, and the ugly, religiously serious people today tend to look only in one direction, the past. Now, I do say this partly out of autobiographical frustration, what I've called elsewhere my Flannery O'Connor problem and yours. Many of you know this problem of mine. Whenever I introduce myself to anyone as a Catholic writer, in my head I count to 3, 2, 1, and they say, do you know Flannery O'Connor? Do you know Chesterton? Do you know Tolkien? They're all dead. That's the problem. Don't look to the past, right? Don't look to the past alone, is what I should say. So instead of only looking to the past, if we are called to read the signs of the times that we are in and engage this culture, I think this means making sense of why, at best, a pretty good movie featuring an evil clown has enjoyed so much success. Again, over 100 million views of that trailer we watched in 24 hours, $500 million at the box office, and by no one's view, some remarkable work of art. What is that telling us? What is that feeding? What is that drawing on in terms of the intensity of interest that we saw specifically in an age group, 18 to 24, in that movie? It, the movie, does not hold up very well against St. Thomas's concepts of clarity, proportion, and integrity, as we shall see, precisely because it's governed finally by an understanding of evil and of our response to it that amounts to the evil twin of moral therapeutic deism. Pennywise the clown preys on children by identifying and then exploiting their fears. Each of the main characters in the story is terrified by the clown's workings, in most every case by something ghoulish or strange or threatening that has its source in an unresolved childhood trauma, a personal struggle, or a family issue. These encounters often happen in the midst of grown-ups who never notice anything. Bill struggles with his little brother George's death and his playing a part in it unintentionally. Mike struggles with memories of a house fire. Beverly is going through puberty while living with an abusive father. Stanley, the son of a rabbi, which has no effect whatsoever on the story, is beset by anxieties whenever he has to go into his father's office. Eddie is a hypochondriac, and Richie, well, Richie doesn't like clowns. I mean, he gets lucky that way. It's pretty straightforward in his case. So Pennywise the clown manifests himself to each child in ways that capitalize on these fears. And the power of his evil resides in his ability to scare them into submission, captivity, and death. But none of these fears have anything to do with evil produced by either disordered acts of free will or deprivations of the good. In other words, this, I think, representative work of contemporary culture can't give us a worthy sense of evil, a worthy sense of the false, the bad, and the ugly, worthy, in other words, of pointing in its very absence, to the presence of the true, the good, and the beautiful. The very nature of Satan's depravity at the end of Inferno points us to what we will find in purgatory and ultimately in paradise. It can't do that same work as a representative moment in our culture. To be sure, the movie more broadly provides us with evidence of evil, especially when it comes to representations of free will enacted in fallen ways. The townspeople have a kind of quiet, collective agreement to ignore the awfulness around them. More immediately, when it comes to the main characters of the story, Beverly's father mistreats her. All the other kids are subjected to bullying, to taunts, to brutal attacks by older teenagers. There's one boy named Patrick whose rage and violence makes him especially susceptible to the clown. In all of these secondary ways, the movie demonstrates clear and engaging components of St. Thomas Aquinas' criteria for beauty: clarity, proportion, and integrity. And it succeeds in these respects as an aesthetic representation of evil. Everything kind of matches pretty well. If you feel this, or you're struggling with this, this happens to you. It kind of makes sense, in other words. But the film's overall intention and even ambition, I argue, is too captive to the weak religious spirit of our age. In the movie's climactic sequence, Pennywise captures Bev and spirits her away to his sewer system dungeon, where he does not kill her, but instead places her in a kind of levitating trance. Her friends decide they must rescue her and also put an end to this evil clown before he can take any more children from the town. They enter his lair and endure an escalating set of terrors, both collectively and tailored to each of them, culminating in Bill's meeting with what appears to be his murdered little brother, who pleads with Bill to bring him home. We saw that in the trailer. Through much suffering, Bill recognizes that this isn't his little brother, but instead a manifestation of Pennywise, which leads eventually to a kind of extended action movie-style battle that results in a stalemate between the kids and the clown. It's now that Bill and the other characters discover why the clown hasn't killed them, why he can't kill them. Their friendship with each other provides solidarity and a call to courage and sacrifice that defeats the isolating fears that the clown depends upon. Each character realizes that the terrors confronting them are nothing other than their externalized psychological weaknesses. Bill realizes that the reason Bev isn't dead yet, well before her friends joined her or she discovered the psychological sources of the clown's power over them, is because of a courageous kiss from a friend who has a secret crush on her. Because of that, she's not scared of the clown. And the clown can't kill what's not scared of him. Yet, the movie is tellingly silent about ultimately why she's not scared. It offers no substantial evidence, but moves quickly into the next sequence in which Bill and his friends turn the tables on the clown, noting that now he's scared and indeed he escapes into a deep well where he has to wait until the movie's sequel, which came out in 2019. With the clown gone, the kids rally around each other and the movie ends in a gauzy, feel-good way. The music and imagery affirm that because they believed in each other and believed in themselves, they have defeated evil. Moral therapeutic deism, as Christian Smith defines it, is the and this is demographic in terms of his sociological analyses, therapeutic deism is the operative faith of the majority of American teenagers, which is to say of no less than half the people who watch this movie. Moral therapeutic deism is characterized by the following. Number one, a God exists who created and ordered the world and watches over human life on earth. Number two, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught by the Bible and most world religions. 3, the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about yourself. 4, God does not need to be involved in one's life except when you need a problem resolved. 5, good people go to heaven when they die. Now, in closing these remarks, I have no intention of attempting to repurpose these points into an account of immoral therapeutic evil as opposed to therapeutic moral deism. Instead, what I'd like to suggest is that the great appeal of a movie like It resides in its offering a representation of evil that is easy, that is mushy, that is moral therapeutic deism in its representation of the good. Evil exists, and it shows up in weird ways that grown-ups can't understand. Evil takes root in our lives because of psychological issues beyond our control. Only coming to terms with these and through teamwork can we combat evil. Now, the problem with such a representation of evil is that it's so amenable to emphasizing the false and bad and ugly as the default qualities of a human life, which sounds pretty right, I think, to a therapeutically attuned average North American teenager. At the same time, for those formed and committed to a higher order understanding of the human person and of our place in the divine plan, for those seeking to right order their lives and the culture according to the enduring truths of faith, of beauty, of reason, it's hard to make sense of how evil exerts pressure on these efforts if we have to take evil as a clown. It's hard to take that kind of evil seriously, even while it's enjoyed and taken seriously by millions of others. And I think this is what makes It, the movie, a dark mirror for us. By making evil into a clown that occupies a natural spot in moral therapeutic deism's cosmology, it's entertaining to encounter and a perfectly late North American cultural paradox. Reaching now the final section of my remarks, and turning to my work more as a novelist than a professor, I want to acknowledge that it's easy, it's convenient to be critical of efforts to find faith and beauty and reason only in the past, and then likewise, simply to point to their absence in the present, to punch down, as it were, on a movie like It. So then let me offer, in closing, another dark mirror, a brief reading from my most recent novel, Dante's Indiana, copies of which are on sale in the trunk of our car after today's event. Why did everyone laugh? I was dead serious. Annie, you brought the books, right? They're in the car? Yeah, okay, good. So let me offer in closing a brief reading from my most recent novel, Dante's Indiana, by way of indicating where and how I think a little light can indeed be found in the here and now. The novel concerns the creation of a Dante theme park in an opioid-ravaged small town in the middle of America. And just as we learn in the opening canto of Dante's Inferno, that in order for Dante the poet to tell us about the goods he found in paradise on his otherworldly journey, he will, quote, also tell the other things I saw. I'm going to read a selection from Dante's Indiana near the end of the novel, when the theme park, modeled as Inferno in one basketball arena and Paradiso in the one beside it, there's no purgatory because the backers are evangelicals who don't believe in purgatory, is about to open. And so the people in Dante's Indiana are rehearsing their parts a final time. And so to close, I'm just going to read to you from that section of the novel. So this is first person in the protagonist, Prin, as he's finally going through this theme park that's opened up. I began in Inferno. I walked through dry ice to the elevators, which were set into a wall painted like dark woods. Inside, there was a growling, a lion, a wolf, a leopard, above me, beside me, behind me, lurking. Stepping out at the top into more dry ice, I went down along the wraparound concourse. The way was lined with molten boulders and scorched broken walls, video arcade games where you could slip your hands into studded black glove controllers and punish sinners, two-person stations where you could take turns, strange colored smokes and smells and cries for help that played over grinding guitars and driving drums, barking dogs and moaning contortionists in masks and red leather. Tall men in high black collars buttoned over their faces. They came out of dark corners holding lamps of human heads to show the way down and down and down. Roving searchlights moved across the black screening that covered the stadium seats, lighting up the faces and bodies of devils and the damned. On the main floor, a funhouse mirror maze for the vain and false, a train ride through a haunted house that had a brace of winged devils, a whirling teacup ride for wrongful lovers, a twirling elfin tree that oozed the fingers and faces of suicides through its cracked, shuddering bark, laneways of hot coals with scorched feet sticking out, where you could see for yourself what happened when you made money off God, a bubbling black bog lined with fishing rods so you could pull up the raging faces of the wrathful. Those had to be the worst jobs. Other performers staggered around, split apart or missing body parts or holding extra body parts, talking to themselves or asking someone, anyone, to hear their stories through broken and cracked lips. Paid performers, I prayed. I made my way towards the giant Satan at the far end of the arena. His three foreheads were red and black and white metal. His eyes were holes of electrified yellow light set in chains and melted tires. The ice rink around him was painted black and smoked with more dry ice. His three arms lowered. The massive torsos of upside-down Judas, Brutus, and Cassius had bucket seats inside them. Workers lined up to climb metal stairs bolted along the sides of the traitors' raked, roaring faces and bashed bodies before passing through doors cut into the sides of their scorched pelvises. The riders were then strapped in and lifted into one of Satan's chomping mouths, mossy, misting, smoking, flashing red lights and thunder. I walked past Satan towards the tunnel that led between the parks. The elevators were set into a wall painted to look like a starry galaxy. Inside one was a smiling young woman in a ruby red velvet gown, one of the Beatrices. Trumpets and French horns filled the air. Glowing constellations and laser lights beamed onto the floors and walls and ceilings. Long stone-framed glass slabs were set up at intervals along the concourse, onto which were projected holographs of saved souls reciting cantos from Dante and verses from the Bible. At opposite ends of the arena, just above the floor, were choir lofts full of white-gowned singers with combed-out hair. They were practicing a collective duet, call and response, back and forth, human voices in harmony, washing and warping. I passed a carousel playing tinny, celestial organ box music, its horses transformed into heavenly creatures, griffins, lions, eagles, rams. Beside it was a kiddie ride, individual spaceships zooming around a track inside a band shell painted as the solar system, held in the massive palms of God. A corner of the arena had a bumper car pen, each car done up as a winged and laughing baby face. The rest of the floor was full of performers going over their routines, dancers, jumpers, dog groomers practicing on cuts of high-pile carpet draped over sawhorses. The arena seats were covered in screens that made 9 rings, shaded beige to yellow to gold to bright white. Every now and then I heard the shuddering and slamming of the roller coaster next door as it descended, trailing shrieks. Eventually, I made my way to the Ferris wheel. We went up. I looked down. How high up before our lives look so fitted? Young men in cropped angel wings dropping into bungee cord dives and pulling up their body-socked partners, cloud-painted skylift cars sailing for the middle air, massage chair thrones, their buffed, rotating pads catching light, gymnasts in white feathers and brown bodysuits, building themselves into a giant eagle, and then laughing as they flapped their wings and took flight, leaping and tumbling to the floor, the sound of the choirs, a distant spread of crashing joy. Thank you.
So, yeah, you've given us much to think about, and I'm glad you concluded with some remarks from your novels, because something you said near the outset spoke to me, that you try to tailor your writing to, I think, in a way that the culture would be receptive, rather than kind of pronouncing or that sort of thing. I think that very much comes across. You, I think, do a very good job of holding together what I'll call objective, but maybe you would say fair or non-ideological portrayals of reality in your novels. They're self-deprecating in a way, light, autobiographical, and I think indicating a kind of humility and self-awareness, an understanding of our faults and contingencies that let us, see past triumphalism, partisanship, and overemphasis in a rare way. And this autobiographical style, I would say, at least from the couple that I've read, you don't bother to conceal yourself, I might say. Prin is I think very, very much like you in some ways, just the good ways, of course. But this is a feature of art now. I would say I'm not an English professor or an art expert, but the author in the postmodern era can't pretend to conceal themselves, and can't pretend to this kind of distance, objectivity, and neutrality. That such attempts are in fact failures, some might say. And at the core of that belief that there's no point in trying to conceal yourself, there's no outside of truth-limiting subjectivity or perspective. So I want to ask you, with that preface, why have you chosen to write in the style and manner that you do? What is gained and what is lost by all of this transparency and striving not to seek the perspective of others, the perspective of disinterested neutrality or objectivity?
Thank you very much, Peter. That was a great question. Thank you for affirming my humility. Just making sure Anna heard that. Yeah. So I think in some ways what you're asking is why is it that I have made the decision with my fiction writing to start to tell stories through a character whose life a bike riding Sri Lankan Catholic English professor who lives in the east end of the city, et cetera, associated with a failing Catholic college in downtown Toronto, et cetera. All fiction, obviously, but why make that connection? What does it make possible? So I think maybe I'll say a little bit about my life as a writer. I want to say something about a talk I went to just yesterday, and then I think I can answer your question that way. The Prin novels are, I think, maybe my third and fourth novels. And what I heard from editors, from readers, from critics after my first couple of novels was, okay, we get it, you've read a lot and you're funny, but these are performances. You're not in these books. You're just giving us something, but there's no stakes. There's no sense that you're invested in the story you're telling. And so I made the decision with this set of books that I'm writing right now to be more open, I guess, to the ways in which the life of faith, family life, professional life, the way these things can play out. At the same time, as I suspect the majority of my remarks tonight suggested, I feel like I have a vocation and responsibility as a cultural observer to make sense of the world we're in. And if I put those two things together, by way of Prin, I have a way of making sense of the world where there is a sense of stakes, because I can't imagine inhabiting the world that he's in. Were any of you at the Pelham lecture at Victoria College last night? The Pelham lecture last night was delivered by Sheila Heti. Sheila Heti is a Canadian writer. We're the same age, and we've kind of come through the literary world together, and we've come through in very, very different ways. And I'll just say that she also writes very much autobiographical work. And she was explaining last night as part of her remarks that there is no such thing as a person, and that there is just this phenomena, and we try to make sense of it. And she has no concept of an integrated sense of the human person, and instead, she is kind of deploying, I would say, a much more postmodern, fragmentary way, in brilliant ways that get a lot of attention and critical acclaim. I've chosen a different view. I've chosen a view to kind of make sense of what it means to be a human person in the context of, let's say, Bernard Lonergan's sense of tension and unity, that we are not just a heap of fragments, but that we have to find ways, that we want to find ways to bring things together. So if that's true in my sense of self, it should also be true in my sense of myself as having a vocation to writing, and in so doing, drawing on lived experience, not limiting myself by any means to lived experience, but drawing on it as a way to read and make sense of the world around me and tell a story about it, where again, there's a sense of stakes. I'm not going to disavow and distance, but I'm invested in this sense of storytelling.
Wonderful. Well, another theme, I think, self-described of the first two of the Trinity is satire. And, satire, it helps us take ourselves in the world lightly, see our faults and those of others, our failings and the injustices of the world with a bit of humor. But on the flip side, it can be, quite biting and contemptuous. And today, I find anyway that it's taken for granted. I might even say like the lingua franca of large swaths of the professional and intellectual classes. To a lesser extent, the beliefs and worldviews of the average person, but it's really seeped in, I think, to practice irreverence, dismissiveness, a kind of just lack of moral seriousness, frivolity, this idea of therapeutic deism you talked about, and just, a lack of recognition of the intrinsic value and sacredness of things. When we have this approach, I feel like we're blind and shut off from awe and wonder and the majesty and beauty of creation. And I guess I'm suggesting that the satire and sarcasm maybe is out of balance, out of kilter, not necessarily in your works, but in the culture. So I'm curious as to what you think about that assessment. Where do you think the line is between healthy and unhealthy sarcasm and satire?
I would draw a distinction between satire and parody. I think what you were describing largely is parody. And satire is actually a deeply moral mode of engaging the world. Because To be a satirist is to question what do people think is the good, and then attend to it for a little while and make sense of whether that really is the good or not, right? And so I think we may have a category distinction where people think something is satirical, but really it's just a parody. Meaning what? Ultimately, you're safe. You're not testing anything. You're not challenging yourself or the culture. It's a kind of confirmation game over and over again of affirming what we all already quote unquote know. Whereas satire, I think, takes greater risks. So that maybe the other way to think about this would be that if you think about parody, with parody you can almost always figure out where someone ultimately is. Whereas I think with satire, great satire, you can't say ultimately this person is on this side or that side. So what is my goal with the Prin novels? That if you are a devout Catholic or you are a total atheist, you're getting it from me equally, right? That you can't sort of go, oh, clearly we can see where his thumb is on which scale. But in fact, satire is supposed to be, for lack of a better term, ecumenical.
That's brilliant, and I definitely think it does come through in the novels, so I'd encourage everyone to pick up and read. I want to quote from, there'll be those plugs. I would like to quote, like you did from Dante's Indiana, what would Dante do? Wake up far from vine and write his way to heaven, even if he had to go to hell, go through hell first. And he did it, and he was not alone. He did it, and he was not alone because someone who wanted to see him on the other side, Molly. Did she want to see me on the other side of whatever was between us? Yes. Yes, she did. It's a beautiful passage that I think speaks clearly to the warmth in our heart that we cannot enkindle without the hope of heaven, the everlasting life characterized by the bliss of beatitude, of pure, unadulterated love, and this cynicism and sarcasm that alluded to earlier, this kind of this worldliness of our contemporary era. Do you see that the lack of faith there is what deadens the heart, or is deadening the heart of people in the culture, among your students and colleagues? And what is the way to gain more hope and faith in our lives?
So Peter, you're asking me with people recording this whether I think my students and colleagues have dead hearts. Is that correct? Is that I want to clarify the question you're asking me, because I see the kind of the career red light just blaring right now.
Oh, students in general. In general.
Do students generally have dead hearts? That's the uplifting question you're asking? I see. Let me answer the question in a positive way. I recently made the decision to start watching a prestige television show called Fleischman in Trouble. Anyone watch Fleischman in Trouble? No, Jesse Eisenberg, Claire Danes, Adrian Brody, prestige television. And it's all about Gen X, mid-40s, urban elites, and their marriage has fallen apart, and what happens next, basically, is what the story is about. And it's getting written up in all the right places, it's there in the culture, and so I have a certain kind of sense of responsibility to see what the culture is making of it. And I left it before one episode was finished because I could tell what it was so quickly. And the reason why I could tell what it was so quickly was because it began and ended with a sense that, well, marriage didn't work out, family life is annoying. How do we deal with these things? The presumptions were right there. Whereas the challenge, and this is from my editor when he first read the books, the challenge that I'm trying to pursue in this book is it's a book that begins with the premise that marriage and family life are goods. Not good, but are goods for the human person that are challenged, that are challenged, not attacked by the culture, but attacked by the people in these families and in these marriages, right? And then how does that then play out, I guess you could say? So it's a greater challenge than, let's say, the movie It, where you begin with these kind of presumptions about how parents don't understand you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which are easy to knock down, right? So if you start with a more durable, fuller sense of married life, of family life, but don't deny all the challenges associated with it, well, then I think you can tell a story that has some legs.
Yeah, very good. I think it's coming across the balance, the sincerity. You can't hide any of the difficult parts of storytelling if you're trying to make your point. So two more questions. One about the art world and the art scene, and then another about the way of beauty, which is very much in vogue today. And then we'll go to audience questions. So to me, what I find most characteristic about modern and postmodern art is intellectualization and abstraction of subject matter, the emphasis on raw expression, subjectivity, appeals maybe more to the limbic system, that they can sometimes be very, very simple and devoid of artistic skill if we're talking about the fine arts, but also in film, as you kind of alluded to with your example through it. They're lacking these things, but they're characterized by this game of they're constantly kind of pushing boundaries and constantly seeking novel portrayals for the sake of novelty, I guess, if you will. So seeking the novel, desiring to transgress and even to offend or excite, and to indulge a little bit maybe in the ugly, to wallow in it as a kind of catharsis. Perhaps this is born of profound levels of alienation and loneliness and disconnection from higher visions of the human person that you alluded to in your talk. So I imagine you'd rightly take issue with much of that maybe one-sided portrayal, but I imagine you think there's something there, and maybe even a window into what people are seeking in art today. I would say maybe it's like they're suffering a great deal from profound spiritual poverty, and their intellectual understanding of the world doesn't afford for that faith, truth, beauty, and goodness. And so art as that space for transgression, a space to express fundamental unease people have with their fundamental moral and spiritual condition, even an area to explore their fascination with the great themes of life. These things, maybe these loftier themes, have been kind of tranquilized and deadened. So what do you make of that formulation?
I think that consistent with maybe one of the things I was saying about the movie it is easier to represent what's ugly than it is to represent what's beautiful. And it's easier to point to absence, the obverse of the true, good, and beautiful. I think this is generally true, whether you're religiously attuned or not. So I think on that point, Peter, probably we're in agreement that you do see more absence as opposed to presence. And perhaps the difference, let's say, in much contemporary art would be there is no indication that this absence is meant to point to any kind of presence. It's just absence, let's say, right? But then we jump back, and I was in Rome in April and May of this past year, and I saw a lot of Caravaggio. And Caravaggio got into my head as a result. I spent some time thinking about Caravaggio. And I thought about Caravaggio when you were mentioning transgression. Caravaggio frequently hired prostitutes to serve as his models for representations of the Virgin Mary and others in his paintings. Caravaggio is canonical at this point as a great religious painter. But you can imagine, in the time, this painter, who also was a murderer and a pimp, was incredibly transgressive. But that transgressiveness was connected to a remarkable skill, a manual skill that you see in his art. And if any of you have seen Caravaggio, whether in Rome or elsewhere, you have a sense there is something brutal and intense and dark about his paintings that matches a lot that was brutal and dark in his life. And so one of the beauties of having a continuous sense of the human person rooted in higher things, and a continuous sense of how we represent and respond to representations of it, is to step back and say, well, Caravaggio wasn't painting pretty angels on coffee mugs, right? And if we know more about how Caravaggio painted, we know that in that moment, I mean, think about it. If somebody described what I just did now, today, it would be a huge controversy about someone making decisions to use sex workers as models for the Virgin Mary and other female saints, etc. You could imagine, right? The great controversy today, and this is what Caravaggio was doing as a painter, right? Not entirely, but it was one of the ways. And so if we take a little distance, we can realize that some of the challenges you are describing are net new because there's still a greater sense of absence today. He was responding to a fullness and finding a way to respond to it that was rather dark and brutal at times. And so that tension might not be there as much today, but there are still some continuities that I think we should seek.
And final question before audience questions. So if you have one, please prepare to make your way up. We've only got one mic. So on the theme of the beautiful today, the Via Pulchritudinis, as it's called, the way of beauty, a way into the faith, a way into experience and seeing God, perhaps the easiest way in for people, because the way of truth through postmodernity, people don't really believe in that as easily. And as you described with the phenomenon of moral therapeutic deism, don't like to be told that morality isn't of their own choosing. So Via Pulchritudinis, the way of beauty, this is described as the way in by Pope Francis. This is something that Hans Urs von Balthasar kind of noted in his writing. What do you make of it? Do you see it as a very successful way of reaching people today? And if so, how can we do more?
I would say that there could be success with respect to something like architecture. I was just reading the other day about the ongoing work on Notre Dame in Paris and the excitement, the great general excitement in French public life and in kind of larger global life in the recreation of this marvel, right? That ultimately is marvelous because of what it's meant to enact and represent. And what was interesting to me was that the priest, as you probably know, from the early 19th century onward, major Catholic churches in France are government properties on the outside, but in a sense, what happens on the inside is the province of the church. And it's one of these understandings. So this priest was explaining how on the outside, basically to everyone, it looked like, it's Notre Dame is back. But on the inside, yes, Notre Dame will be back, but they're trying their best to think about what a contemporary response should be. And this is a real risk if you think about it. Because at some level, what would we want? A recreation of what once was. Because none of us want some terrible, abstract, extreme reimagining of this great cathedral. I get that. But there's got to be something in between. Because if it's just a recreation, then it denies every contemporary artist the opportunity to create in the moment. That all you're supposed to do is do what they used to do in the past. That seems to me like a great challenge. The second thing I would say with respect to the question of the way of beauty, for me, the way of beauty is actually the way of friendship at this point, where it's not so much going to Notre Dame and being upset by what you see or defending what you see, but going with someone else and having a conversation about it. And that someone else could be a believer who's outraged, it could be an atheist who's outraged, who cares? But the point is, don't do it alone, right? And understand yourself as being committed to the way of beauty with and for others. And it's that kind of conversation, I think, that can get us ultimately to a better place.
Wonderful. Great way to conclude.